can email it to me, or you can also bring it in on Tuesday, bring it on physical hard copy. Whichever one, I don't care.
Did you forget about the grades again, or you?
No, I'll do it over break, yeah. I've been swamped the last couple of days with clients, so. Apparently, the holidays are not good for people's mental health.
Who'd have thunk it?
Yeah. Well, so sometimes it's that. Well, no, really it is, right? So for some people it's that, and other people it's, you know, spending time with your family is not enjoyable.
Yeah, I noticed that after COVID, like, not to make fun of it, but some people like just wanted to come and talk.
Yeah, no. I had a lot of people over COVID who probably didn't really have anything clinically wrong with them. They were just really lonely.
Needed to get out.
Yeah. So they didn't really have an outlet to socialize with.
Yeah, especially the older generation, because they didn't want to go somewhere dirty or contaminated, so they knew that an office setting would always be cleanlier.
Well, that's also like, you know, especially for elderly people, that's you know, we have a serious epidemic of loneliness with elderly people. A lot of elderly people feel very isolated. So what a lot of us experienced during COVID is what a lot of elderly people experience sadly all the time, yeah. So especially elderly men, which is the next to trans people is the highest suicide group. Yeah, so especially like white men above the age of 65, yeah, they're a high suicide group. Yeah, they're alone and they don't really feel like they have anybody to talk to.
Do you ever see those places like the old folks homes where they do like kinder care basically, so
Yeah.
like the little kids get to socialize with them?
Yeah. Well, a lot of countries do that. Yeah, like
Yeah.
like in a lot of countries, yeah, kinder care is it's at old folks facilities. Yeah, so they combine generations together. So it kills multiple birds with one stone.
It's really smart, honestly.
It really is. Yeah, I'm a big fan of it. So, all right, people are here. Okay, guys, let's talk about making babies. Okay, so I would make the argument that the reproductive system is the single most important organ system we've talked about all semester, namely because without the reproductive system, none of us would be here, right? So organisms can reproduce one of two ways, so sexual and asexual. What type of organisms reproduce asexually?
Seahorse? Oh no, wait, it's a male that does it.
Most fish.
Huh?
Most fish.
No, all animals are sexual reproduction. So basically one-celled organisms. So yeah, so anything that would be a prokaryotic organism, so like bacteria, protozoas, other kinds of things. So anything that is a eukaryotic organism is going to reproduce sexually, meaning there's going to be an exchange of what we call gametes, right? So that includes plants, right? So how do plants do it? Pollen, right? So yeah, so the pollen comes from the male part of the plant, and then that goes into the female part of another plant, right? So that's why it's really important to have things like hummingbirds and bees, and right. So like that's the difference between bees and hornets. Like bees are an important part of the ecosystem. Hornets are just a-holes that like to sting things. Right? They don't really serve any actual benefit to people, right? They're just evil. Yeah. All right. So the reproductive system includes glands, tubes, all sorts of other things that produce and nurture sex cells, which would be the gametes. So what is the male gamete? Spermatozoa. And what would be the female gamete?
The ovum?
The ovum, oocyte, egg, right? So, so the functions of the, now, of the two systems, the female reproductive system is significantly more complicated and has a lot more to do. Because the male reproductive system just simply makes gametes and then delivers them, whereas the female reproductive system has to both make and deliver gametes as well as host the developing embryo/fetus and develop it to full term so they can be viable outside of the body. So like many other aspects of life, women get the short end of the stick when it comes to their occasion. So we will start with the lesser of the species. We will start with the male. Okay. The primary sex organ of the male reproductive system would be the gonads, which would be what? What are the gonads of the male reproductive system?
Is it the testes?
That would be the testes, right? What would be the gonads of the female reproductive system?
The ovaries?
That would be the ovaries, right? So these are where the actual gametes are produced, housed, and stored, and then delivered. Okay? All of the accessory structures are primarily a supportive function, right? To either store or with the delivery of the gamete, So this would include, like, for example, the vas deferens, the seminal vesicles, the bulbourethral gland, and then, of course, the penis. So those would all be what are called the accessory organs, okay? So the testes is found externally of the body. It is found in what is called the scrotum. Why are the testes in a scrotum, and why is the scrotum descended from the body?
Temperature regulation.
Temperature regulation. Sperm production happens at around 95 to 96 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 35 degrees Celsius. So it happens at just slightly lower than body temperature. So for example, you have a couple that's trying to conceive and they're having trouble with fertilization. One of the things they'll say is, you know, they'll tell men, like, don't wear briefs, right? Wear boxers, don't take hot baths, don't sit in a hot tub, right? Do whatever you can to try and, like, keep everything a little cooler, and that might help increase sperm production, okay? So spermatozoa is developed inside of the testes. By the way, the testes are also responsible for producing testosterone, which is why we call it testosterone, because it comes from the testes. So it's responsible for both sexual production as well as secondary sexual characteristics. Once the spermatozoa is made, it is stored here in the epididymis, and then if sexual excitation and then ejaculation occurs, it will go from the epididymis through the vas or ductus deferens. Okay, it will go up here, okay, and then it'll come around, and then here you have the seminal vesicles and prostate gland. The seminal vesicles and the prostate gland are going to produce chemicals that allow it to combine together to make a cocktail which we call semen. So semen is spermatozoa plus other chemicals in there. So the prostate gland and seminal vesicles produce chemicals which make it more likely for the spermatozoa to survive the journey up the vaginal canal, up the uterus, and hopefully into the fallopian tubes where there's an awaiting oocyte to be fertilized, okay? And then you got the bulbourethral gland, which also produces some chemicals. So all of that will then go through the prostate, into the urethra, prostatic urethra, and then to the penile urethra, and then it will be ejaculated out. So that is the journey for the spermatozoa. So we've got some internal structures as well as external structures. What is the main purpose of the penis? Penis has got a couple of different structures to it. So if we have what's called the corpus cavernosum. The corpus cavernosum has lots of hollow kind of tubes in it that will fill with blood, causing the penile tissue to become engorged or erect. And then we have the corpus spongiosum, which has a lot of the other kinds of structure in it. So what's the function of the penis, especially the erect penis?
Reproduction.
How does it facilitate reproduction?
I don't know what you're asking me.
Why does it what's the function of it getting erect?
Insertion.
Insertion into the vaginal cavity, which thus drastically increases the likelihood of fertilization happening, right? So fertilization can happen without penetration, right? That's an important distinction to remember. But the likelihood of fertilization goes up dramatically if you have penetration into the vaginal cavity. Okay? So they're accessory structures, meaning they're not technically necessary for reproduction. That being said, it's a lot easier for reproduction to happen if you have a penis. But right, we can still extract the semen and do it artificially. Okay, so the testes are ovoid in structure. They're going to have about 250 lobules, and they're going to be filled with seminiferous tubules. Those seminiferous tubules are going to produce the sperm, and then the sperm will be stored inside of the epididymis. And then from the epididymis, we go to the ductus or vas deferens. Okay? So inside of there, we've got these cells called Sertoli cells. Sertoli cells are actually going to produce the spermatozoa. Okay? So sperm is very simplistic. Okay, so we got the Sertoli cells, which actually produce the sperm, and then we got Leydig cells, which actually produce the testosterone. Okay, so both are produced inside of the testes. So Sertoli cells, sperm; Leydig cells, testosterone. But you don't really need to know that inside of the Sperm itself is very simplistic. It's basically a missile with a DNA payload, okay? It's very simplistic. You've got the head, which includes the genetic material, and it's covered with a cap called an acrosome. The function of the acrosome is to dissolve some of the wall of the ovum so that the genetic material can be ejected into the nucleus of the ovum, combined with that DNA to create what's called a zygote, which would be a cell with 46 chromosomes. So the spermatozoa's got 23, the egg has got 23, combined together that gives us the 46 that you guys have. Okay? So the head has got the DNA, and then it's got something to punch a wall in the egg so you can deliver the DNA. And then you got the mid piece and tail, which provides the flagella, which just swims its way up the vaginal canal, through the cervix, up the uterus, and hopefully to the fallopian tubes, where there is an awaiting ovum to be fertilized. Okay? So very simplistic, not much going on in there. So spermatogenesis starts happening during puberty. Spermatogenesis causes the spermatogenia to enlarge and become primary spermatocytes. So in the male embryo, the spermatogenic cells are undifferentiated and are called spermatogonia, each containing 46 chromosomes. You have literally trillions of them, and then after puberty, they undergo spermatogenesis, and then they will start to undergo what we call meiosis. We've learned about mitosis. Who learned about meiosis in some type of biology class at some point? So what's the difference between mitosis and meiosis, guys? So the product of mitosis, so we've got what are called haploid and diploid cells. Okay? So haploid is going to be what we would call 1N, and a diploid is going to be what we would call 2N. Okay? So 1N would be one group of chromosomes, 2N would be two groups. So all of the cells in your body except for gametes are going to be diploid cells. Okay? So meiosis is just like mitosis, but we're not doubling the DNA. So we're taking a 46 chromosome cell and we're splitting it up into two 23 chromosome cells, right? So we create what are called gametes, okay? So that's what's going on with meiosis. If you guys want to read up on it, I would recommend going on Crash Course. There's a really good video that explains how meiosis works and the difference between mitosis and You'll need to know a little bit about that when you take like the DAT, because there's some genetic stuff, like stuff you have to cover for the DAT. It's still the DAT they did, right? Yeah. DAT. Okay. Yeah. So you'll need to learn some genetics. We'll talk a little bit about genetics as well. Okay. So the cells will undergo meiosis to form haploid cells, which contain half the chromosomes of a normal cell. So the DNA, the cells will split without doubling the DNA, so you end up with half the chromosomes. So you have a secondary spermatocyte, which will then form a spermatid, which will then mature into a sperm cell. Okay? This process is basically going nonstop, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, from the time you start puberty till the day you die. So theoretically, a male can produce offspring up until the day they die. So they have a significantly longer window of time that they can reproduce compared to females. Who here so our 10th president was John Tyler. He was our 10th president, right? So he was vice president for a guy named William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison was the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe. It was a battle against Native Americans where they put down an uprising. And they ran on a slogan of Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Anybody remember learning about that in school at some point? So William Henry Harrison had an 8-hour inaugural address in the pouring rain in D.C., got pneumonia, and died 30 days later. And then John Tyler took over as president. And so he was president in the early 1800s. He was the last president born before that was subject to the crown, right? So he was the last president born before we were the United States. John Tyler has a living grandson. He was president in like 1810, and he's got a living grandson. When John Tyler was like 75, you're like, yeah, what the heck, right? When John Tyler was 75, he had a kid. And then when that guy was 75, he had kids. And one of those guys is still alive at like 92 today. Right? So like, right, so you occasionally, right, or you hear about like celebrities, like Picasso, I think, had a kid at like 79 or 80, stuff like that, right? So in theory, right, men could have kids well into their 70s and 80s and into their 90s. I think like the one, like latest, like a guy in his 90s, like fathered a kid, something like that.
I think Robert De Niro had a kid. I think Robert De Niro actually.
He's
had a
got
kid,
one out, but
like a
Pacino just
year
got a
ago.
new kid, yeah, so, yeah. So, yeah. So, I mean, what do they care, like, they're not gonna be able to take care of it, so. Okay?
At least the money would be
But, so this process is constantly happening, right, and, if ejaculation does not occur on a regular basis, the spermatozoa will just be broken down, the components will be recycled, and new spermatozoa will be released. Speaking of which, there is a culture phenomenon that has taken place in the United States that happens every November. There is absolutely no medical benefit to doing that. Ask any urologist that will tell you that there's no actual benefit to doing that for the entire month of November. So, right, it's not going to help your testosterone levels, not going to help your reproductive health in any way. So, if you want to do it, go for it, but there's no health benefits to doing so. So again, once the spermatozoa is produced, and again, a sexual excitation and then ejaculation starts to occur, it will go from the epididymis, where it's stored, through the vas deferens, to the ejaculatory ducts, into the prostatic urethra, at which point the seminal vesicles and prostate gland and whole urethral gland will secrete their solutions to combine with the spermatozoa to make semen. It will then be entered into the penile urethra and then ejaculated out. So that is the path that it is going to take. Okay? Your epididymis are tightly wound. If you were able to unwind your epididymis, it would be longer than you are. So there's literally like 15 feet of duct coiled into each testes. So it is an extremely convoluted ductive network. So it can store literally hundreds of millions of spermatozoa at any time. And this is, so once they're produced, they kind of just sit there in the epididymis until they maturate, and then if they're not ejaculated on a regular basis, they will be broken down and recycled. So the vas deferens is approximately 45 centimeters in length. It goes up into the body cavity, and then into the ejaculatory duct, and then into the urethra. So again, if you decide that you do not want to have any more children, you can simply go in and get this cut, and this will prevent the spermatozoa from being ejaculated. It won't produce it from being produced, it just won't be able to be ejaculated. So we call that a vasectomy or vasectomy. It's a very common procedure, and it is close to 100% effective form of birth control, but it's not a 100% form. It's not about forms of birth control. Okay. So seminal vesicle produces some chemicals that include, it's an alkaline solution because the vaginal cavity, the vaginal canal, is slightly acidic. So it produces an alkaline fluid to help neutralize the acidity of the mucus lining of the inside of the vagina and uterus. Also produces fructose, which is a fuel source for the sperm, and prostaglandins, which cause the muscles inside of the female reproductive tract to spontaneously spasm and to contract to kind of pull the spermatozoa up in the vaginal canal and up into the uterine lining. Okay? So its job is to kind of just help make it easier for the spermatozoa to get to where it goes. The prostate gland also produces fluids. It primarily produces an alkaline fluid, which also helps neutralize the acidity of the vaginal canal. And then the bulbourethral gland produces a chemical which can lubricate the glans penis, or the tip of the penis, to make insertion easier for everybody involved. A typical ejaculation is going to have about, semen is going to have about 120 million sperm per milliliter, and the average ejaculation is going to be somewhere in the order of 2 to 5 milliliters. So the average ejaculation can have somewhere in the order of 5 to 600 million spermatozoa, which is about the amount you need to have in order to increase, to have a good chance at fertilization. Matter of fact, we consider you to be functionally sterile if you have a sperm count below 2 million for ejaculation. That's how many spermatozoa you need to have in order to facilitate fertilization happening the old-fashioned way. Right? Obviously, if we have even one spermatozoa, right, we can do the in vitro, we can do it in a lab for everything. But if you want to make a baby the old-fashioned way, you need a lot of spermatozoa because not many of them are going to make it probably. Okay? Sperm are not ready to actually fertilize until they are actually within the female reproductive tract, right? So they're the unique chemical environment of the female reproductive tract causes what's called capacitation, giving them the capacity to actually fertilize the egg. So, and that takes about 6 to 12 hours, right? So fertilization oftentimes happens 12 to 24 hours after intercourse is actually occurred. So again, we talked about the testes. Testes are a pouch of skin, suspends below the abdomen to allow the spermatozoa to function, or if you produce it, has to be below a certain body temperature. Penis is a cylindrical organ, right? So we got the corpus cavernosa again, it fills with blood, causes the penis to become turgid or erect. Again, it makes it easier for penetration to occur. Penetration makes it much more likely for the spermatozoa to be delivered up the vaginal canal and up into through the cervix and into the uterus, and then up into where the fallopian tubes are. On the end, you have what's called the glans penis. The glans penis is covered with extra skin, which we call prepuce, also known commonly as foreskin. Right? So here in the United States and many other places, it's common to surgically excise it. We call that circumcision. In other parts of the world, it is less common to do circumcision, and it is becoming increasingly less common here in the United States to do circumcision. So, and it's become somewhat of a controversial subject for some people.
Does it actually have like any kind of real benefit? Does it even have any kind of real benefit, or is it just preference?
It's just kind of, it doesn't really have any benefit for anybody. It's kind of, so the main reason why, so first off, where did circumcision start? Who started doing circumcision first?
Jewish people.
The Jewish people, right? So it's part of the covenant Abraham made with God, right? So Abraham was the first guy to get circumcised at the ripe old age of 100. So that had to have been super fun for Abraham to do that. So it's a cultural thing for the Jewish people and other similar groups similar to that area of the world. And then it became commonplace in the United States, really starting in the early mid 20th century. The main reason why it took hold and became popular in the United States was there was a belief that if you got circumcised, it would make teenage boys less likely to do stuff to themselves, and also less likely to develop to become gay. So, yeah, so it's one of the many like really dumb things about why we now have sexual education in the United States. So, for example, so who here has heard of Masters and Johnson? Have you heard of Masters and Johnson? They had there was a TV show about them on Showtime. So there's Masters and Johnson. There's also a guy named Alfred Kinsey. Masters and Johnson and Kinsey were the first like scientists and academics to like really like actually do like real like research on like human sexuality. So like for example, for a long time like people believed really silly things. Like for example, if you had sex in certain sexual positions, you could guarantee that you'd have a boy versus a girl, or like you could contract STDs from sitting on a toilet, or chronic masturbation would lead to blindness, other kinds of just silly stuff, right? And like a lot of people believe this stuff because there's really no evidence to support otherwise. So Masters and Johnson were really kind of the first people to come along and like debunk a lot of stuff and actually like study like what happens during sex from like an actual like scientific and physiology standpoint. So they kind of dispelled a lot of the rumors that it persisted for really long periods of time about things. Okay. All right. So the male reproductive system and the female reproductive system are regulated the same way. The hypothalamus tells the anterior pituitary to release two hormones, FSH and LH. Follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the testes to produce spermatozoa, and then luteinizing hormone stimulates the testes to produce testosterone, which leads to these secondary sexual characteristics that start to develop at puberty. All right, so first, the hypothalamus releases gonadotropin releasing hormone, which then tells the pituitary gland to release luteinizing hormone and follow-up co-stimulator. So luteinizing hormone creates testosterone, FSH causes spermatozoa to be produced. These are the same two hormones that stimulate puberty and reproduction in women. So it's the same hormones, they just work on different organs. Male sex hormones are called androgens, and so anything that stimulates male features is called an androgen, the main one of which is testosterone. There's also dihydrotestosterone, which is actually the more potent form of testosterone. So dihydrotestosterone is what actually causes a lot of secondary male sexual characteristics and largely is responsible for sex drive. It's also the hormone that causes male pattern baldness. That's one of the things you will see from people that use steroids. So you'll see them, sometimes they start to lose hair. But you have to already be prone to it in order for that to happen. Right? That's primarily due to, it's called dihydrotestosterone. Testosterone is secreted in a fetus until birth, primarily by mom, and then really not again until puberty, and then it's continuously secreted. As we get older, testosterone production does start to go down. It's sometimes referred to as andropause. Right? So when women have menopause, and we do see a steep decline in most men starting around 55, 60. You start to see a steep decline in testosterone production in men as well. So again, testosterone stimulates the development of the male reproductive organs, causes the testes to distend and develop those secondary male sexual characteristics. So men's voices typically drop 1 to 2 octaves. We start to develop body hair, thickening of the skin, squaring of the jawline, increased muscle mass, all of that. Hormones like testosterone are regulated, same way most things in the body are, by that negative feedback loop, right? So the body detects that testosterone levels are low, sends a signal to the thalamus. Hypothalamus then releases gonadotropin releasing hormone, which then tells the pituitary gland to release luteinizing hormone, which tells the testes to produce more testosterone, right? Which is why if you don't test your hormones, your testosterone levels at the exact same time every day, you might see a fluctuation as much as 10 to 15% difference over the course of one single day. Right? Typically, we produce most of the testosterone in 2 big pulses, one usually about pre-dawn and one at dusk, for reasons we still don't understand why. But the same thing happens for women as well too. You tend to produce a surge of estrogen in the morning and then at night. All right, so let's talk about the female reproductive system, which again is significantly more complicated because not only do you gotta produce the gametes, but you also got to store and house and develop the growing embryo/fetus. At what point do you stop calling it an embryo, guys, and start calling it a fetus? Heartbeat. Generally about the 9th week, we stop calling it an embryo and start calling it a fetus. That's usually generally the point at which we make that distinction between the two. Okay. So the female reproductive system is almost exclusively internal. There are some limited external genitalia, so that would include the clitoris, labia minora, and labia majora. So those are the only external parts of the genitalia. The rest of it is inside. The gametes, or the gonad, is the ovary, which produces the ovum. It's also where estrogen and progesterone are produced. You then have the cervix and uterus. So the uterus is a dome-shaped structure when empty and becomes more globe-like as it starts to fill with the developing embryo/fetus. And it will form a temporary organ with the fetus called a placenta. The placenta is a temporary organ that is developed as well too. And then you have the vaginal opening right here, which is basically a fibromuscular wall with a mucous membrane. Okay. Primary sexual organs are the gonads. Again, they produce the secondary sexual characteristics as well as the ovum. So the medulla is mostly connective tissue, blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves. And it's inside the cortex is where you will actually find the follicles that produce the ovum. Okay. So when you are inside of mom, you develop your own uterus and ovaries and all of that, and inside of your little ovaries, you start to develop what are called literally hundreds of thousands of what are called primordial follicles, and then those will go into a form of stasis, and they will stay in stasis until you have what's called menarche. What's menarche, ladies? What's wrong with that term? So it's kind of an older term we don't use as much anymore. So menarche would be when you have your first menstruation, right? So once you start menstruating, that means you're now ovulating, and you're going to produce an egg every month until you stop ovulating, at which point you will then go into what we call what?
Menopause.
Menopause, right? So once you're in menopause, that's the end of the reproductive phase of your life. So you have a narrower reproductive window compared to men, which we'll talk a little bit about when it comes to some.
So does that get triggered when you run out of eggs, or is it like based on like other things like genetics?
That's when you run out of eggs, yeah.
Like literally just once you're out.
Literally, that's why you go into menopause. Right? So So the only reason you have a menstrual cycle, which we'll talk about more, is the reason you have a menstrual cycle is every month your uterine lining builds up in preparation for the implantation of a fertilized egg. If there's no egg being released, there's no need for the uterus to build up the endometrial lining. So that's why you stop building up the So every month you build the endometrial lining. If you don't get pregnant, you slough off the endometrial lining that is built up because you don't need it anymore because we're not hosting a fertilized egg. So, huh? Some women, it can happen anywhere between about 30 and 60.
My stepmom
yeah,
got a full hysterectomy and ended up in menopause in like 35.
Yeah, so if you get a hysterectomy, you can go into menopause very early. For most women, it's typically late 40s to mid 50s. But it's not unheard of, but it's pretty rare for women at 30 to have it, but it does occasionally happen. For most women, it's going to be somewhere between 45 and 55, sometimes 60, yeah. So, but there has been documented cases of women giving birth well into their 60s. Why we want to do that, yeah, but there's documented cases of women do it. So, but there's also been documented cases of women as early as their late 20s. Anybody want to know the youngest person ever to give birth?
5 years old.
She was 5 years old. She was raped and then she gave birth to a baby.
She's from Peru, right? Lena Medina or something.
Yeah. She went in.
Yeah,
Yeah.
his father.
Huh?
That's the youngest father.
Think
Not similar age, like 7, 8, something like that. Yeah. So she was like 5 or 6 years old when she gave birth. So that's way out. All right, so when you're inside a mom, you will have all of these little primordial oocytes, and then by the time you're getting ready for puberty, you only have about 400,000 oocytes remaining, and of those, only 400 to 500 will be released during your reproductive life cycle. So 1 month you'll release one from your right ovary, next month you'll release one from your left ovary, and then it'll keep happening month after month until you run out, and that's when you'll stop menstruating. And again, you menstruate purely as preparation, right? So every month, your uterus is getting ready to be pregnant. That's pretty much every month is what it's doing. So I saw a really great tweet one time, basically summarizing. It says, uterus wants baby, uterus doesn't get baby, uterus gets revenge. So that's pretty much what's going on. So every month, like the endometrial lining builds up in preparation for fertilization, and then when it doesn't happen, right, it sloughs off the endometrial lining, and then the next month the process starts all over again. So it'd be a lot easier if you could just get text messages, just nope, not pregnant this month, you're good to go. That would be a lot easier for you. So beginning at puberty, oocytes are stimulated, they will undergo meiosis, they will become primary oocytes. And then they will finish meiosis, become a secondary oocyte and a polar body. So basically, you half the DNA just gets thrown away, and then the other half develops into basically a fully functioning cell, except it has half the DNA. So the egg has got mitochondria, lysosomes, all of those organelles that we learned about early in the semester, which is why, right, we talked about this. Where do you guys get your mitochondrial DNA from?
Your mom.
Your mom. We got it from her mom, or we got it from her mom, right? So you have the same mitochondria DNA as your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother, right? Because it's passed down through the egg, right? So the egg is where you get your mitochondrial DNAs. You have to have a starting point. So the egg's got all of the organelles, it's just missing out the DNA, right? Because the spermatozoa is just DNA, that's all there is to it, okay? Okay, so you undergo the meiosis 1, then you go undergo meiosis 2, so you end up with a polar body, which is just DNA, and then all of the other stuff. So the DNA plus all of the organelles in the egg. And then again, 1 month your right ovary will release, and then the next month your left ovary will release an egg. That will continue every month until you run out, and then you will begin. Menopause, it's kind of right. It's not like 1 month you menstruate and then you're done, right? It's going to be one of those. Anybody have a mom or an aunt or somebody that's gone undergo, right? So like it's sometimes a gradual process, right? So like they'll go 2-3 months without menstruating, and then all of a sudden there'll be another menstruation. So it's kind of one of those it's it's not like an on-off switch. It's almost like a dimmer, like you're slowly turning off the tap sort of thing. But there are some cases where like they're menstruating and then like 2 months later they're done and it never happens again. But for most women it's kind of more of a gradual process, right? And it's super not fun for most women. So we got the mature follicle, which has got a zona pellucida and a corona radiata. So corona radiata literally means radiating crown, right? So it reminded the depictions of like angels and Jesus with like the light coming off of them, right? So that's why it's called the corona radiata. Okay. It's about a 28-day cycle. So here's how the 28-day cycle works. So when does day 1 of your cycle start, ladies? Day 1 is the day you start menstruating, right? So that's day 1 in the cycle. Count forward about 14 days. So you'll end up with a primary follicle, right? Primary oocyte, and then this is what we would call a mature graphene follicle. So over the course of about 14 days, that follicle will fill with fluid, and then about day 14 in the cycle, the follicle will rupture. So we call this a corpora hemorrhagica, right? So day 14 in the cycle is the day that you ovulate, right? After you ovulate, what's left of the follicle will turn into what's called the corpus luteum. Literally means, how do you say yellow in Spanish? Huh?
Amarillo.
Amarillo, yeah. So in Latin, it's yellow, it's luteum, right? So the corpus luteum, and then it will downgrade into the corpus albicans. Right? This is day 14 in the cycle. This is about day 15, 16, 17 in the cycle. And then starting about 4 days after ovulation, so the corpus luteum will continue to produce progesterone, which will tell your uterus to keep building up the endometrial lining. After about 4 days, if this doesn't become fertilized, the corpus luteum will start to downgrade into the corpus albicans. Then your progesterone levels will drastically drop, and then you'll start to slough off, and that's day 1 or day 28 in the cycle, right? So it's a approximately 28-day cycle. It's important to note that it's very unusual. Very few women have a clockwork 28-day cycle. It's much more common for women to have a couple of day window, right? So sometimes it's a 27-day cycle, sometimes it's a 31-day cycle, right? It's very unlikely for it to be an exactly 28-day cycle. But roughly 14 days in is usually ovulation. So, okay, so that's what's going on with ovulation. Okay, so if oocyte is not fertilized or is released, it will degenerate. So you got about a 3-day window, right? So about a 3-day window in which fertilization can happen, after which point the egg is no longer viable for fertilization. You got to try again next month if you're trying to make a baby. Okay. So we got the uterine tubes, otherwise known as the tubes of also known as the fallopian tubes. That's why they call it the fallopian tubes. named after an Italian doctor who first figured out what they do. So they're named after him. So you got the fallopian tubes, okay, which are right next to the ovaries. So once the ovaries release its egg, you got these little finger-like thing called the fembrae of the infundibulum. They'll kind of rhythmically beat, and they'll suck the egg up into the uterine tubes. So in humans, we call them the fallopian tubes. In other animals, we just call them the uterine horns. So not very okay. So from there, the cilia will pull it into the fallopian tubes, and then over the course of a couple of days, it will go from the fallopian tubes into the uterus, which again is a dome shape, and it has a fibromuscular kind of a sphincter at the entrance called the cervix, which opens into the vagina. You've got 3 walls to your cervix, or to your uterus. So you've got the glandular endometrium, which is the part that builds up. You got a muscular wall called the myometrium. That's what actually contracts during labor to actually expel the baby. And then the outer perimetrium, which is largely connective tissue. Okay? Once the egg has hit the uterus, it's no longer viable, right? So fertilization actually happens inside of the fallopian tubes. Okay? They don't have very long shelf life, 2 to 3 days max from the time ovulation starts, right? It's about how long you have. So if it's hit the uterus and it hasn't been fertilized, it's no longer viable, and you can put as much sperm in there as you want, and fertilization is still not going to happen. So you have a fairly narrow window every month for fertilization actually.
And is it like completely impossible outside of that window?
Outside of that window, it's completely impossible. Yeah. Yeah. So, unless, of course, like you're storing the eggs cryogenically and then doing fertilization that way. Yeah. But yeah. So now that being said, because not everybody has a clockwork 28-day cycle, right? Unless you have a clockwork 28-day cycle, right? You probably should not rely on, well, I'm probably out of my fertile window right now. Right? So a lot of people try to rely on the fertile window for birth control. We call it rhythm method. So which is, okay. We'll talk more about birth control here in a little bit. Okay. So the vagina, it's fibromuscular. It's got a mucous membrane to it. Sometimes the orifice of the vagina is covered by a thin film called a hymen. That's not 100% true. Lack of hymen is not an indication that a girl is not a virgin. Some girls are not born with one. Okay. So here's the structure. So egg, right here, about day 14, the fembrae will kind of rhythmically beat, suck the egg up into the fallopian tubes. It'll make its journey over the course of a couple of days. If it gets fertilized, it'll implant here inside of the endometrial lining. The endometrial lining will continue to build up, and then over time, the developing embryo will connect with tissues inside of the endometrial lining to create that temporary organ, which we call the placenta. Okay, so once the egg is released, the corpus luteum produces a chemical called HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. Human chorionic gonadotropin tells the endometrial lining to continue to build up. If the egg becomes fertilized, the corpus luteum will remain for a couple months, at which point the placenta will develop, and the placenta will release the chemicals which will tell the endometrial lining to build up. If the egg is not fertilized, the corpus luteum will downgrade after about 2-3 days, maybe 4, to the corpus albicans, stop producing human chorionic gonadotropin. The lining of the endometrial lining, the blood supply will dry up, and then the endometrial lining will slough off, and that's the menstruation that you ladies endure every month. So, right, you think you're pregnant, go to the store, get a home pregnancy test, right, pee on the stick. What are we testing for? We're testing for the presence of human chorionic gonadotropic hormone, right? So that's what we're testing for in the urine. So that's what the pregnancy test is looking for, is HCG. And that's also what we're testing for when you go into the doctor and they confirm that you're pregnant. Right? So they'll take blood and they'll look for the presence of HCG in the blood. Right? So that's what we're testing for. And they'll say, congratulations, you're pregnant. So this is the endometrial lining. Here's the myometrium, and then the perimetrium, and then here's the opening of the cervix. and then here's the vaginal orifice right there. Same process by which the male reproductive system works, the female reproductive system works. Starting approximately age 10, hypothalamus starts to secrete gonadotropic releasing hormone, which starts to release LH and FSH, right? And then that's when girls will start to develop secondary sexual characteristics, and then start to go through puberty. Okay? So the main hormone responsible for secondary sexual characteristics for women is estrogen. Progesterone, which stays relatively stable over the course of the 28-day ovulation cycle. The one that puts you on a hormone roller coaster is progesterone. Progesterone's job is to trigger the proliferation of the endometrial lining and then the drying up of the endometrial lining if fertilization doesn't happen. So some women experience significant mood swings and other issues related to pretty big swings in the progesterone. We call that premenstrual syndrome. Not all women have that. Some women do, some women don't.
What if someone in menopause like act crazy then?
Same kind of thing, like fluctuations in hormones and stuff like that.
Is progesterone at play there?
Yeah, so which is why oftentimes for women in going through menopause, we will give them progesterone to help with that. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So it's the fluctuation in progesterone that often causes the mood swings that sometimes happen during the menstrual cycle for some women, and also during menopause. So estrogen, and then also as you go through menopause, estrogen starts to decrease as well too. So oftentimes women go on estrogen. So estrogen is what makes women women, right? So that's right. So if you don't have enough estrogen, like skin can dry out, other kinds of things can start to happen as well too. So menarche is defined as when the first menstruation happens, because it's caused by a surge in FSH. We just kind of talked about all of this. Okay, so day one of the cycle is the day that you start menstruating. Fast forward, right? So menstruation will go for somewhere between 3 to 7 days for most women, and then over that time period, the developing follicle grows and grows and grows, and you will see that progesterone levels will spike about day 14, right, causing the release of the ovum. Then the corpus luteum will start to secrete HCG, which will tell the endometrial lining to continue to build up, right? And then by day 28 of the cycle, if the fertilization hasn't happened, there is a drastic drop in progesterone and a drop in estrogen as well too, simulating the endometrial lining to stop the blood supply, and then the endometrial lining will slough off. So that's why, right, you can sometimes see dips and fluctuations and mood and other things because there's surges, right, there are peaks and tides and hormones, whereas men, it's kind of the same all year, all day long, every day. Okay. Menstruation will continue until you run out of eggs, and then menopause will happen again. For most women, somewhere between 45 and 55, but it is going a little later due to environmental factors, and also menstruation is happening earlier and earlier. So throughout most of human history, and well, even into the 20th century, most girls did not start menstruating until 14, 15, sometimes even 16. We're now starting to see like the average age as being like 11, 12. A lot of girls are starting to do it at 11 or 12. We do think that's due to environmental factors, so like chemicals in our environment that are mimicking estrogen, right? So yeah, it used to be much more common for girls to 14, 15, sometimes even 16 before puberty would kick in. And then we got the mammary glands. Both men and women have mammary glands. Both men and women can lactate, and both men and women can develop breast cancer. So the mammary glands are basically just modified sweat glands. Instead of producing a liquid that's got a lot of salt and waste products in it, it produces a liquid that's got proteins and fats in it, aka milk. Okay. They're located in the breast, on the anterior thorax. And then you got the nipple, and then the pigmented skin called the areola. Why is the areola darker in color and it's got those little bumps on it? And why do those bumps get noticeably bigger and the areola and nipple get noticeably darker during pregnancy? Anybody have a friend, sister, cousin, anybody that's had a kid? They get noticeably darker during pregnancy. Why does that happen? First off, why is it differently colored in the first place? And Like there's little bumps there.
It's a different gland.
Well, it's not, well, it's different, but why is it, and why is it differently colored on men and women? Why is it differently colored? Makes it easy for the baby to figure out where to put their mouth so they can nurse. And so it makes it easy for the baby to figure out where to go. So you got all of these glands and then lactiferous ducts that are in there. You have lots and lots of lymphatic tissue in there, which is why, again, like you find a lump, right? We oftentimes will do what's called a lumpectomy, because if the cancer starts here and it gets into the lymphatic system, then it can spread, or what we call metastasize, to other parts of the body. Questions on any of this stuff? No? Okay. All right. Let's talk a little bit about genetics real quick, and then if you guys want, we can go